So we're recording, okay.
Thanks a lot.
So anyway, welcome to 500 Years of Lutheranism in the next 50 minutes. So what I wanted to do is sort of do an overview of who we are and that sort of thing as either a refresher or something. Who knows, there's probably people here who know more than I do about it, but oh well. The stuff I gave you is far more than we're ever possibly going to do. In fact, there's, if you look at it, there's pages worth of stuff about the history of Lutheranism in the U.S. over from the from 1600 to now. So obviously that's much more than we can cover in this. But I want to, if you want to follow along, sort of, who knows how much I will do with this, but sort of start at the beginning and look at some overarching themes and that sort of thing, and then probably jump pretty much to the latter half of the 20th century bit, and largely ignore the mergers and all that sort of stuff that happened through the 1800s and early 1900s. So to start with, the Lutheran tradition is very much an immigrant tradition. You know, if I don't have a map of this, I only have a map of the U.S., but if I'd have a map of Europe, you'd see that following the Peace of Westphalia and the, I want to say, 1560s, give or take, areas of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Denmark, Netherlands, Northern Germany became primarily Lutheran. Areas to the south and west of that were largely became Calvinist, and the southern portion of Europe remained Roman Catholic. So what ended up happening is when immigrants came over from the old country, you know, they imported their church along with the rest of the culture and that sort of thing. So the church and culture became very intertwined, which is, at least in some sense, still it's still a little bit of a problem and the Lutheran denominations, because they're still sort of very ethnically defined. You know, there's this sort of joke going, well, not really a joke, a fairly major critique going around of you know, some of our fellows who are not of Northern European descent, that there's almost an equality between Lutheranism and lutefisk. You know, because, or at least Lutheran and Northern European ancestry bets. So, and that was sort of perpetuated through the early part of the colonial period, in that, you know, clergy were still trained in Europe and would come to the colonies and early states and that sort of thing. You know, and the language remained for some time to be the European language, whether that would be Norwegian or German or Swedish or Finnish, you know, which worked fairly well in the insular communities of of colonization, but then, you know, once that started to break apart, it, you know, created some challenges. So there's that bit of, you know, at least through the first several centuries, actually clergy were trained in Europe, and they were, and you know, coming to the North America was not a desirable call. It's sort of like somehow, you know, sort of like rural U.S. sort of tends to feel like it is nowadays. So there's that bit of language ethnicity. One of the important, I think, tenets of Lutheranism is the role of education, particularly of educated clergy, which differentiates Lutheranism from a number of other Protestant traditions, where the clergy / the leaders of the congregation tend to be ones who are just sort of built up out of the particular congregation and that sort of thing. There's also, the tradition of colleges and that sort of thing that came out of the late colonial, early American period, and continue for that. What do I want? So, okay. This is going to be very random because I'm, as I said, trying to cover way too much info in too short of a time. So what are the things that define who we are? There's the role, place, and authority of the Bible. How do we understand the Bible? What authority do we give it? How is that mediated? And that question comes into play, as I say on the thing, in the many mergers that happened over the 19th and 20th century. Because whether or not we can, agree on the Bible is one of the big sticking points. Do we go, in the direction of the ELCA, claiming that the Bible is the norm of our faith and life, the inspired Word of God, or do we go in the direction of some other denominations and claim that and use the inerrancy language? Okay. The role of laity. How did the laity function? In the colonial period and early 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of, let's say, open space, especially in once the Northern European ancestry people started moving into the western part of the country. And so there was a lot of, there were not a lot of clergy to go along with them. So you had this growth in lay leadership built up. And that fits relatively, it fits moderately well with Luther's sense of the priesthood of all believers. There is the office of the minister of word and sacrament, or the office of the minister of word and service but the carrying that performs specific roles, but the carrying out of the mission of the gospel is that priesthood of all believers for all bit. Worship and sacraments. There are, start with sacraments, 2 of them, baptism, communion, and the other 5 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church find their way into Lutheran tradition pretty largely as rites and traditions, confirmation, marriage, ordination, confession, and extreme unction. Those 5 did not meet the criteria of being instituted by Christ and having a salvific promise joining with them. But yet, I think there's this mixture that ends up coming in, which we get in, the title minister of word and sacrament. I like to think of Lutheran worship as being bimodal. If you're familiar with probability distributions, I don't know if anybody's familiar with probability distributions, but there are 2 main focal points in worship. the word, primarily as it comes out through the gospel and the sermon, but also things like hymn of the day and that sort of thing, and the sacrament and the celebration of the sacrament. And in many ways, both of those have relatively equal weight. In some traditions, the celebration of the Mass ends up being much more prominent, and to some degree Roman Catholic churches, but definitely once you get into Orthodox churches and that sort of thing, the celebration of the sacrament of the Mass elevates. In more in other branches of Protestantism, it is the Word that becomes supreme, and the sacrament becomes of lesser degree. But Lutherans, I'll say what I ultimately really like about the Lutheran tradition and the ELCA in particular is that it finds this middle ground of honoring and celebrating both of them. It's why I don't like having confirmants do sermon notes. I change it if I'm going to have them do it to worship notes, because the meaning doesn't just come out of what I say in a sermon, right? You can find it in other parts of the worship service, and those other parts may be considerably more profound for you, especially on that day. So there's that. Okay. There's two continuums that I want to highlight, and then we'll sort of jump into the more modern day. The two of them are two P words, piety and polity, which you may or may not actually know the terms. Piety, I'll say piety, the piety continuum looks at, how does one live out or view the life of faith. On one end of the continuum, you have the pietist movement. This sort of wraps around, if one wants to throw in technical language, orthopraxy. It deals with what actions and feelings and that sort of thing one has in connection to the faith. And one can, put it forward as, emphasizing how the faith, how your faith affects the way that you live your life. On the other end of the scale is orthodoxy, which involves right thinking according to doctrine and that sort of thing. As is the case with most continuums, living on the ends of the continuum, can create problems. The very end of the pietistic one in Lutheranism is where you get the whole don't dance, don't play cards, don't do this, don't do that, don't do, all that sort of stuff. On the extreme end of orthodoxy, it doesn't really, there's a disconnect with how faith impacts your life. As far as what has become the ELCA, I think there is that most of that spectrum is in play. There are various, because, well, I'll do my next point. Polity, because the polity plays into how that lives out. So polity has to do with the method of governance of the broader church structure. Just like the piety one, there is a continuum of ecclesial to congregational. Ecclesial is very strong hierarchical power through the role of bishops or presidents or whatever terminology is used in the particular tradition. Such things as the Roman Catholic Church or, oddly enough, the United Methodist Church, where the hierarchy has a great deal of power and authority over how things are done and run and that sort of thing. In both of those traditions, the bishop or the president can largely at his, or in the case of the United Methodist, his or her whim, move clergy here or there, what have you. On the other end is the congregational bit, and that, at least at its extreme, really has no hierarchical structure. Everything's based around the local congregation. Many fall somewhere in between those two extremes, and there we have the ELCA, along with a number of mainline Protestant denominations. But they also sort of span, your United Methodist or Episcopal Church are still very Episcopal. You get to certain branches of, say, the UCC or some parts of, well, the UCC can be very congregational. Then you get, you get the Lutherans and the Presbyterians sort of in the middle in a really odd way. I did my interim training at Princeton, so I had a Presbyterian interim training, and that was very curious, figuring out the authority and the role of the session and the presbytery and that sort of thing. So how does that play out? Because we as the ELCA fall, I forgot which way was which. We fall sort of, over here, probably 2/3 of the way to congregational polity, which means that much of the traditions and the way congregations function come out of their congregational history. Going back into that the ethnic ones, and how those have merged and done various things over the last century and a half, give or take. Okay. Any questions with my runabout? Okay.
I was a descendant of Luther. My dad's name is Luther Barsness.
I should do I threw in here towards the end, because I also wanted to, sort of a look at what do we believe, then we'll back up to the ELCA. The Augsburg Confession. This is probably like 2 or 3 pages from the end of the thing. So one of the defining aspects, of course there's the Bible, but as we know, how one interprets the Bible has, almost as wide of a range as any of those other various continuums. So what is it that that we specifically confess? And that's why I threw in these this bit of the Augsburg Confession, which was presented at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, largely written by Luther, or by Philip Melanchthon, one of Luther's main partners in it. So there are, I believe, 23, if I remember the number. No, I'm wrong, 28. Various articles. The first probably 4 or 5 are the heart of the doctrine. And largely the concerning God and concerning the Son pull mostly out of the language of the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. Justification was one of the big challenges at the time of the Reformation. How is one justified before God, by grace or by works? I tend to actually not believe that anyone was really fully advocating that one was justified by works. But there was this split-ish thing that now actually has been sort of I'll almost say rectified in the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which I think was in the early 2000s. give or take, between the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church. But in the in the early 1500s, that was a major point of contention. What I, you know, then it gets into the definition of the church, which I think is actually, it plays into how we end up getting into that mostly congregational polity. The way the Augsburg Confession defines the church is that the church is where the gospel is rightly proclaimed and the sacraments rightly administered. I might be messing my term a little bit, but it's basically where the gospel is properly proclaimed and the sacraments are properly administered. You know, but beyond that, how you do church is pretty much, to use another technical term, adiaphora. It doesn't really matter. Then there's going into the sacraments, baptism, including things like infant baptism, the Lord's Supper, where, and this again is where Lutheranism it hits a very peculiar middle of the road with the confession of the true presence of Christ in, with, and under the bread and the wine, but not going so far as to the doctrine of transubstantiation. Interestingly enough, confession shows up in the Augsburg Confession, similar to how it does, at least in some versions of Luther's Small Catechism, as essentially a sacrament, which is a peculiar little bit. Then church rights,
Question.
Yes.
Liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
Liturgy in the worship life of Lutherans. Was there a reason the liturgy just Lutherans like to sing?
The liturgy itself, Luther personally changed very little from the Roman Catholic Mass. You know, he changed some understandings of the Mass as in the sacrament, but you know, the order of worship and that sort of thing essentially stayed. And yes, music is very important in the Lutheran tradition. Unlike some of the other Protestant ones, like there were the radical reformers, the radical Swiss, Ulrich Zwingli. He decided that he was going to nail shut all of the organs, you know, so that there would be no music other than the human voice. You know, but the liturgy, I'd say the liturgy and the music in Lutheran traditions largely continued on from the Roman Catholic. You know, and then we've added our own various flares into it and that sort of thing. But that said, you know, how you, in the more modern renditions of Lutheranism, I can really only speak ELCA. I'm not sure what other Lutheran bodies do with this, but you run the gambit on, you know, I could have thrown into my various, my little set of continuums, you know, low church, high church bit, you know. You will run into Lutheran services where you don't recognize it as anything Lutheran. You know, you've got some praise music, you've got, you know, a band, then you've got maybe a reading of scripture, and then you've got a 45-minute long sermon, and then you've got some more praise music. You know, to the other end where you have thurifers and incense boats, and, you know, you're doing incense, and, you know, in full vestments, and, you know, and it all works and it all fits. You know, there is really no prescribed bit as far as worship and liturgy, other than I will say the word and sacrament. You know, but the sacrament has played varying parts. I will say I have been wonderfully pleased that I have never had to have the fight over having communion every Sunday. You know, my predecessors everywhere I've gone have had that fight already ahead of me. You know, to value that part, but you know, how it comes out, you know, who knows? There again, you know, how does one do communion? It's actually when I visit churches, which I actually did a lot last summer. You know, that's one of the, to me, that's one of the scarier parts. Going into a place you haven't been, you know, how are they going to do communion? You know, are we going to do continuous? Are we going to kneel? Are we going to do intinction? Are we going to, you know, are we going to do this side and then we're going to do that side? Are we going to do both sides? Are we going to go up there and then all get served and then we're going to wait around until we get blessed and then go back? And, you know, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You know, it is what the particular community finds meaningful in the celebration of the sacrament. But it can be a little confusing as someone coming in from the outside, because there are, you know, in part because it's the one part that really is congregation, you know, has congregational participation. You know, because everyone comes up, or most people come up for communion. You know, and I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that with my rambles. But speaking of that, you know, I'll say to me the two or three of the big areas were the issue of justification. As I said, I think that was actually a falsehood. It's like the idea that, you know, the book of James doesn't have any value because it's all about works. No, it's not. But and then the role of the Mass, or at least how the Mass was done. One of the other big movements was, in the medieval Roman Catholic Church, the laity only received the bread. They only received the host, not the wine. The priest alone had the wine. You know, and then you'd have various masses that you'd buy for people and all this sort of stuff that goes along with that, and indulgences. But one of the moves of the Reformation was that both the laity would receive both the wine and both the host and the wine, which ended up becoming a part of the Roman Catholic reforms in Vatican II as well. And, you know, marriage of priests. Okay. As I said, this is going to be somewhat random. So now I'm going to assume you know Lutherans in the United States from 1600 to 1960. Because it largely remained up to, well, probably I should say 1930s. World War II had a great deal of effect on how Lutherans worked in the United States, largely because there were a number of German and also German-occupied countries, because Germany occupied most of Scandinavia during World War II. So in the World War II, or in that era, the European languages largely fell out of use. And as a result of that, now, since the Swedes and the Finns and the Germans were using English, maybe, but maybe not, we might actually be able to worship together because we could at least understand what was going on. Granted, there are still a number of places I like using my intern congregation or internship town of Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, as a great example of this. Pelican Rapids is probably maybe a little bit bigger than Sandstone, and there were 6 ELCA congregations in Pelican Rapids zip code, including like 3 of them that were within a mile of each other.
Wow.
Why? Because one was Norwegian and one was Swedish or whatever. And so when you get into the mergers of the 1960s into the LCA and the ALC, these groups that were originally very ethnically done were were joined into the into a single or largely two denominations. I have this on like one of the last pages. Maybe it's right before the Augsburg Confession. I have this lovely little graph of Lutheran churches in the United States from 1900 to 2010. And yeah, so there's these, largely mergers of things. There are some splits, and there are a few that sort of just keep going on their own and do neither. So the ELCA came into existence in 1988 as a merger of the ALC, the American Lutheran Church, the LCA, the Lutheran Church in America, and the AELC, the American Evangelical Lutheran Church. Association of Evangelical Lutheran Church. That created some challenges because especially the polity of the polity of the ALC and the LCA were fairly different, which is why we get that stretch of we still get sort of a stretch on the polity bits in the ELCA. Some of my data here is a little bit, I'll say, wrong, because I did this a few years ago. So now, looking at the where are the Lutheran churches? The large majority of Lutherans are ELCA. Still today, the numbers have possibly decreased from my site of 5.36 million members. About half that number are in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the rest are in a wide range of other Lutheran bodies. What else did I say? Okay, so with the joining together of these 3 denominations through the 80s, the process was actually begun at least 5 years. I think it was, the group of the 70 started meeting in 1982. And looking at, how do we put together these differing things, and so they needed to decide several doctrinal witnesses. One being the unaltered Augsburg Confession, which I have at least the articles for in that latter part, as true witness to the gospel. If you go back, there's this American Lutheran controversy of the 19th century. Not really like getting into that. The Other elements of the 1580 Book of Concord were regarded as further valid interpretations of the faith of the church. This is, I believe, they show up, I believe, in chapter 2 of, it's either chapter 2 or chapter 3 of the Congregation's Constitutions. The Bible is the inspired Word of God and authoritative source and norm of this church's proclamation, faith, and life. So I note there the inflammatory language of inerrancy is not mentioned, and the use of the historical critical method of biblical interpretation is firmly accepted. Yay. Both the LCA and ALC had been ordaining women since the 1970s. So women's ordination obviously continued in the ELCA to the point that we're probably almost, I would say we're probably almost getting to the point of 50-50 in terms of active clergy. I know my class 10 years ago was more than 50% women.
My class had 2. Some over 100. I started in 1971, which was the first year that women could go to seminary and actually know that they could be ordained. So there were only 6 that started with us, and 4 of them left.
The LCA was apparently fairly active at the World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches. The ELCA continues both of those relationships. So we're connected, locally and globally through our global partners, and things like companion synods and that sort of thing. Each synod and the ELCA has somewhere between, I believe, 1 and 3 companion synods in other Lutheran World Federation bodies. Most in the global South. Areas. Yeah, our 3 presiding bishops over time. And okay, so I said, the issues of piety and polity are still very much in play, and for the most part, I would say that the ELCA is generally a little bit more towards the pietistic end than the Orthodox end. At least that's my experience of congregations. The polity is, as I said before, I'd say about 2/3 of the way to congregational. There is an overall structure, both at the synod level and at the church-wide. But when it comes down to it, neither of those have a whole lot of power in doing a lot of things. The large majority of power resides in the congregation, with some exceptions. And this is also sort of why I wanted to pull this in, and that is to deal with the issue of how do the expressions work together in the role of calling a pastor and that sort of thing. So this is where it does actually get to the point of broader structures, because that frankly, well, you may agree or disagree with me, but I think that's one of the good things about the hierarchical structure. So to begin with, I'll go back to candidacy. An individual discerns that they a call to ministry, that they would, they feel themselves being called into the role of ministry. So what do? You talk to your synod. Every synod has someone on staff who's who has the responsibility of candidacy. And you talk to them, and then you go through this process of, I'll say formation. Some of it's a little bit, has some problems, in part because it would actually be really nice if we had a more uniform system of candidacy across the ELCA, because a lot of it depends on where you come from, how your experience is. You know, I came out of Region 2. The last page is a map of the ELCA, or of the United States, with the synods and the regions split apart. So, as an example, I started my candidacy process out of Pacific Synod. I was going to grad school at the University of Hawaii at the time, and so that was my my home congregation. That was their synod. So I had to connect with the people in Santa Ana about it, and then they sent me to this terrible psychiatrist in Hawaii. But that's well, no. So one of his main contentions was you could not be you were not going to be a clergy person unless you knew that you were going to be when you were like 3 or 4 years old, and that was the only path that you'd ever possibly considered, which sort of immediately made me lose any sort of respect for him on any other bets. So in my case, we had what was called a multi-synodical candidacy committee. That was everything of Region 2 other than the Sierra Pacific Synod. So Pacifica, Southwest California, Grand Canyon, and Rocky Mountain. As you can see on the map, that covers a huge area of space. Lutherans are not that common in the Southwest or in the interior mountain area. So then there's various steps of that entrance, endorsement, and approval that one goes through through one's education. Entrance is usually at the beginning. Endorsement is following first unit of CPE before internship, and approval is at the end. Saying yes, you are approved to be open for call. That is handled in a sort of dual way between the candidacy committee and the seminary, and run through. There's a division. They keep changing their names at Churchwide, so my table, I think I call them tables in this at Churchwide, have of course rebranded themselves since I wrote this. But there's this part of it. It used to be in the domestic missions unit that dealt with candidacy and that sort of thing. So you become candidate, become approved for ordination, then that's when the call process begins, at least for a first call candidate. This has changed since I went through the process in 2012. At that point, what we did is we submitted our picks for our top 3 regions out of the 9 regions, and then as a subset of those, the top 3 synods in each one. What has changed today in the last couple of years in it is first call. So the synod out of which the first call candidate came now has sort of first dibs on that candidate. So in other words, those candidates that we as the Northeastern Minnesota Synod put forth, once they go through approval and graduate and that sort of thing, they would more than likely end up coming back to Northeastern Minnesota. As it turned out, that happened. Well, as it turns out, I ended up in Pacifica, my home synod, even though it was my second region, is my first synod in my second region choice. I was actually really surprised because I put Region 3 as my first choice, and even put, and I think I put Northwest Minnesota, Southwest Minnesota, and Southeast Minnesota as my synod choices, so I got sent to Southern California.
Steve didn't get any of those choices. Did you pick the Rocky Mountain District?
Yeah, it was the last one on the list. But Mhm. The process was very different. There was no candidacy.
So, okay, so once that happens, and this I'll jump into, you know, the, I'll sort of leave first call because at this point, we'll say, okay, the Synod has names of pastoral candidates who are available. You know, they may be first call, they may be pastors who are in calls, you know, someplace else and are thinking it's time to leave. You know, they may be people who are on leave from call, whatever. So the Synod has a certain number of pastoral candidates that they have who are available for call. Then this is what we're working on through those surveys. We're working on our congregations, on the congregation's ministry site profiles. There's a similar document for clergy. It's called the Rostered Minister Profile, the RMP. And they have, so then what ends up happening, and this is what one of the roles of the Synod in the process is looking at who they have available and, you know, what their characteristics, interests, gifts, skills are, and, you know, what, and then the congregation similarly, you know, there's a big question on there, you know, what are the 5 main ministry character traits or whatever of that you feel are important in your candidate. So, you know, you look at, okay, do we have candidates that match these congregational interests and would work and that sort of thing. Then, once that match is made at the Synod level, then names are, well, actually I should say then the candidate would receive the congregation's ministry site profile and look at it and say, you know, well, no, I'll say I was sent one over a year ago, right when I was, by the way, yesterday is my last day at First Lutheran, but a year ago from that. Today was a year of my move. You know, I was sent one where they said their maximum defined compensation was $10,000. I laughed at it and said, I can make about 4 times that working at McDonald's. It turns out they apparently had a misprint when they did it. Don't have that misprint. Proofread.
You never get anybody.
No.
You know, but anyway, you know, the candidate looks at it and says, you know, I think this would be interesting. I think this particular characteristic of this congregation would be something that I would be interested in. Then they get back in touch with the Synod person and say, yes, I would be interested. You can send my paperwork to them. Or, no, I wouldn't be, and then it ends, you know. So then the congregation's call committee would perhaps, but probably then receive the paperwork of those candidates who said, yes, this sounds interesting. So there's and then basically it becomes a congregational process from there, although there are some hierarchical levels of approval and that sort of thing of the language of the call. But you know, so one of the places where I think congregations most experience the broader church is in the period of transition and call, because you're having to fill out paperwork that's going, you know, onto a church-wide database, you know, and perhaps, you know, you're getting candidates from, you know, who knows where. You know, when I moved from Southern California to northeastern Minnesota. In a week, by the way. But that was I ended one Sunday in Riverside, and I started the next Sunday in Pine River. Probably not the way that one should do it, but you know, so you're getting in this process, you know, you're getting that the bit of church-wide that one probably does experience, other than through things like World Hunger or Lutheran Disaster Response or that sort of thing. You know, and also being hopefully fairly connected with the Synod staff at the time of, you know, them helping with the call process and the call committees thing, and of course doing the figuring out the candidates and that type of bit. You know, as interim, I'll play along while we're doing the ministry site profile, but once we get into call committee, my job is done as far as really anything dealing with that goes, and it becomes then the responsibility of probably Deacon Susan to walk with the call committee through their process.
Who's Deacon Susan?
Deacon Susan Williams is the
She's new, right?
she's the oncoming. Well, she's half-time now, and Brenda Tibbetts is half-time. It's that one. Right now she's finishing up her half-time as the children, youth, and family person in Mora. Through the rest of the summer, she and Brenda are tag teaming 50-50, half-time, and then come the end of August, Deacon Brenda Tibbetts is retiring, and Deacon Susan Williams will be coming on full-time, and that Synod Minister of Leadership Support, I think is the term they use. You know, that's something that changes. That's something that's different from Synod to Synod, how Synod staff is structured. You know, and some Synod staffs are very large. You know, some might almost just be the bishop. You know, all 65 synods do have a bishop. You know, if you look at the map, you can see where ELCA, where the ELCA is prevalent. You know, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, maybe Illinois, and then a little bit in like Ohio and Pennsylvania. As it turns out, the Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin are more the Scandinavian brand, and the Pennsylvania, a lot of that's German brands of, if you want to go back into the things. Although the oldest ELCA congregation is actually in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Down there in Synod 9F.
Is there a key to this map? I'm a little confused about the different colors. What
The
they
different colors merely distinguish the synods. There is no color coordination key. It's filling the map of the U.S. Using the 4-color theory. Although they might only be, I think there are 4. A little bit of graph theory. You can color any three-dimensional map in 4 colors, where you have different colors for things that border each other. That's really the only thing as far as the color coding. I think if you find this map online, they are actually in color. This is the printer's grayscale version. But no, so, the northwest is region 1, the southwest is region 2, Minnesota and the Dakotas are region 3, Nebraska, central, and then south of that, with the exception of Iowa, is region 4. Then Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois are region 5. Then you have 6 in Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. Region 7 is the Northeast, Region 8 is the Mid-Atlantic, and Region 9 is the Southeast. The regions have not a whole lot of role. They do have some, or at least they did when I was doing it in terms of candidacy. Being in the Southwest, we were almost a whole region candidacy group. They have like archives. That seems to be the big thing in Region 3. Region 3 archives at Luther Seminary, all the old congregational records and that sort of stuff. Okay, this was probably not the best rendition of Lutheranism in an hour rather than 50 minutes, but
I liked it, I liked
Yeah,
it.
it was interesting.
Oh,
I wish more people could have got this information.
Something that occurred to me, I have a question. We're reading in all the materials we get, Living Lutheran and all of that, we read more and more how churches are leaving we're a traditional church. And we think we'd like to keep it that way. But there more and more of them are giving up their traditional church as a mission field and doing something different. So you know what I'm saying? There was just a big article of one that they just ran this big mission field, housing and everything in a larger area. If we felt that our main purpose was to grow in members so we could stay, so we know we were a strong congregation, is that archaic? I mean, what would a pastor think about that if you looked at that? That's our main, that's what we wanted most.
I think there can be, I will say, a danger in being too number focused.
And I'm reading more about that, yeah.
Because Jesus' call is not to get more butts in the pews, so to speak. It's to share the good news. The question is, how does one do that?
Well, a lot of churches are finding a new way.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of churches are, there is a challenge with buildings. Well, no, a lot of, I'll say one of the things that on the MSP that I will look at is the indebtedness of the congregation. And if you have a debt that is many times your annual budget, you know, and the reason why you do is because of a building. You know, that's really the one thing. I don't think there is here, if I'm remembering data correctly, but you know, then what ends up happening is one becomes too insularly focused. You get, to use theological language, curved in on yourself, and you go into survival mode, and so you know you have a communal version of what in psychology is called an amygdala hijack. That's where the amygdala floods your system with epinephrine and cortisol, you know, largely so that you can survive an attack. You know, but what ends up happening is that focus is totally on oneself rather than reaching outward. You know, so the question is, and you know, that this was frankly one of my issues with the congregation that had the $10,000 maximum defined compensation, was that I would have eventually taken it because it was close and handy. But you know, their primary concern was to have a pastor to be there so that they can have their funeral in that church. You know, and I suppose if one is interested in doing hospice, you know, though maybe you should go be a hospice chaplain instead, but you know, I don't know if that answers the.
When one of my churches burned in Bagley, and we met with various people from various places, and one of them said something I thought was really striking. He said, when you're designing your building, remember you're designing it for people who don't go there yet. And that's true of anything we do. Any program we have has got to be for those people who don't go there yet.
Because you're trying to bring the Lord to them.
Yeah.
By bringing them in.
The thing that hits me the most when we go back to how the history, the church I grew up in southern Minnesota was the ALC, and that we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s. And as I look back at that and how I was being brought up in the faith was very fundamental. Very fundamental. And the pastor would get up there and he would pound on this. If you were sleeping, you woke up. This is how you get to heaven, and this is how you're going to do it. And I'm in a total different place now. It took me a long time to move beyond that, because when you're that age, this is ingrained into you. And that
I can relate to that real well. My great uncles were a baseball team, and they ended up in the Baseball Hall of Fame as the most brothers in one team. And they played on Sundays, and their parents never saw a game because it was Sunday, and that's a day of rest. So I grew up
and it takes a long
generation
time.
after that.
Yeah. But it takes a long
But
time
it-
to
it
move up
was still
beyond
there.
what we're brought up with.
My folks kind of broke the first thing. They did play cards, but they didn't dance or they didn't.
No, when we look back on what our ELCA ministry is right now, it's just day and night from how I grew up with the ALC.
So what's the difference between Missouri Synod and the LCA?
Can't be a
A lot.
pastor in the Missouri
Yeah,
Synod.
a
A
lot.
woman, the way women are treated.
It'd probably
Kind
be
of
easier to
broad
answer
strokes, broad
the
strokes.
question of what's common between them, but on the surface, probably the most obvious thing is the role of women.
That is kind of what brought me here, but.
You know, but and not just, you know, not just in terms of leadership as far as clergy, but even leadership and the lay structure of the congregation, is very, very patriarchal.
The way we look at the Bible is different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mentioned the inerrancy bit. The Missouri Synod is very staunchly into the inerrant camp.
I'll bite. I should know what it means, I don't.
I want to partially define it as literalism, but it has to do with it. I think the way most groups that claim inerrancy do it by saying that the Bible in its original language contains no errors in terms of anything.
It's a science book?
It's
a history book?
In Genesis 1, that is how creation happened. They were 7 24-hour long days. As one defines an hour as however many seconds using the vibration of a cesium-133 atom. Of course, they probably wouldn't actually get so far as acknowledging that there is such a thing as a cesium-133 atom to define
That's true.
the length of a sentence, of a second.
Is the Wisconsin Synod
The Wisconsin
even
Synod
more-
is more conservative.
Yeah.
Then
they're
the-
farther down.
They are farther right than the Missouri Synod.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, I had a discussion with somebody from the Missouri Synod Church, and I said, we had just been to, there's a new museum in the last 10 years west of Denver, and it's fairly recent that they found all those dinosaur things there.
Mhm.
And they can date the Earth how many million years?
I know.
No. If you go by that,
It's
If you-
6,000 whatever years
right,
Yes.
old because
And it's
you date it
fact.
by
it's fact.
Right, if you go by the Bible,
you,
that's
you
exactly
date it by
what
the
It's fact.
by the life, the length of the life of people in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's inerrant. The Bible is that inerrant.
They had something on PBS about that, I don't know, in the past year. It was very interesting. But
Yeah.
it just kind of was very frustrating too, because
It is
You-
very frustrating.
and there's also this thing in them about needing to agree in terms of doctrine. There's a Missouri Synod pastor after 9/11 who prayed with community people at Ground Zero, and he was defrocked for doing so
why?
because he prayed with people who were not doctrinally aligned with the Missouri Synod.
Yeah, they're very fussy about that.
So I couldn't go to communion in a?
No,
Oh,
and it's a closed table.
I belonged to the
very-
Gideons for 10 or 12 years, and my big ministry with them was because I shouldn't have belonged to them, because when you filled out their form, I lied a little there. I shouldn't have been there, but they wanted me so bad that they would overlook it. But when I went to all these different churches, I went to every kind of Protestant church there is. It shocked me that the Missouri Lutheran was way far out there above most of the rest of them. And it shocked me, because I didn't realize that.
And
That-
what's the
I
one
think-
that's even more restrictive?
What?
What's even more?
The Wisconsin Synod is,
Well, in the Wisconsin Synod too, we lived just half a mile in southern Minnesota. We went to a different church, but the Wisconsin Synod was only a half mile up the road. And my dad was brought up there, and he was confirmed there, and him and my mother were supposed to stand up for a baptism, and they could not, because they weren't there with the Wisconsin Synod.
Well, I
And
have
this
to,
is so far out that you
Yeah.
can't stay there.
if things like liturgy and hymnody, you probably would not
You would
notice
know-
a
you
whole
would
lot of
know the
difference. You'll have as much or more variation going from one ELCA church to another one.
Yeah. My dad was the third son of Germans. The first two got Missouri Synod. The first two got a farm. My dad went to college and he went home to the farm to work every summer, but because he went to Luther College, he no longer could take communion at his church, even though he came home to work in the summer.
Now, this is far out in a Lutheran.
Remember that,
Theology.
you know, that, to me, that's really extreme.
How you can stay there and believe like I believe, I can't do it.
Well,
Anyway,
as a divorced woman, I went to communion at a Catholic church and I was never struck down dead. I went more than once.
You know, there are, yeah. Yeah.
well,
Well, just another quick story. Gideon's and I'd go and then we'd take collection to get the word out throughout the world. That's what my mission was with them. And I was there at
Hinckley.
Lutheran Church, the Missouri Synod, and did my talk, and I knew what the answer was gonna be, but I wanted to confront the pastor. I said, can I take communion today? They had open arms for me to come, and I could get money to
Yeah.
spread the word, but I could not take communion. That's way out of line.
Well, we appreciate all the work you put into this.
Yeah.
And it was very good.
Yes.
Oh, amen.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you wanna do a continuum sometime.
I don't know. Well, you know, I totally skipped over, you know, all the, or at least the large majority of the history that I have in this thing, but,
We can read it.
you can read it. I have pared it down from hundreds of pages to, you know, about 8 pages,
Incredible.
Oh, good job.
Yes.
in the process, but, okay, I think we can end our recording.